You're listening to a Hebrew in Israel podcast with Yoel Halevi, exploring the language, culture, and history of the Bible. For more information, visit us at HebrewInIsrael.net.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Hebrew in Israel Haftarah series. I'm your host, Yoel Halevi for HebrewInIsrael.net. I want to thank you for joining me again, and this week we are in the Haftarah of Parashat Behar, and we're going to be reading a really interesting piece because this is a section that deals with a really hot topic that came up this year in regards to witnesses and how witnesses actually work in the ancient world. And it's a really interesting subject because it raised a lot of questions due to the functionality of witnesses when it comes to things which are not legal matters. And due to some issues that came up with the moon sightings that are done, for example, I've been involved in this for quite a few years. And if you're new to this, if you're new to the podcast and all this material, I'm going to explain for a moment what exactly happened and what exactly things are. Due to some interesting questions that came up in regards to how witnesses work, I think this is a really good place to maybe talk about this for at least a short while. So witnesses are used in any court system, in any legal system, to allow judges to make decisions. Today, a very strong move in the scientific world, in the world of forensics and so on, is to try to avoid using human witnesses because a human witness can make mistakes. Now, this is, for example, deGrasse Tyson, a very known physicist, very popular physicist. I once heard him say that really we should never really trust human eyewitnesses because human eyewitnesses make serious mistakes, while using hard science and what he called facts is the way to go. Now, I actually kind of agree with him to some degree, but there's something very fundamentally wrong with the way he understands how material works. He's a physicist, and I'm more of a Bible scholar, and I deal more with the question of human thought, while he deals more with physics. And I have to point out that it's very fun to listen to him sometimes, but there are cases where the type of logic he uses is very flawed. And I really hope this doesn't get to him and he gets kind of angry, but from what I hear, he's actually a relatively nice guy. But there's a fundamental issue here of how to actually understand information and data. And one of the things that actually happens is that when in the ancient world you had to prove that something happened or didn't happen, you had to supply a witness, at least one, and there's a reason I say at least one, because we actually have a case, at least one case mentioned in the book of Exodus where we talk about one witness. But a lot of people go into the descriptions that we have in Deuteronomy where it says according to one or two witnesses. And the problem with this the problem that we have is today, everyone's moving more to the forensic sciences to try to prove that something happened or didn't happen. And this leads Dr. deGrasse Tyson to Neil deGrasse Tyson to basically conclude that we can't trust eyewitnesses because eyewitnesses make mistakes. Now, by the way, in a court of law, there's always this really interesting conflict between what happens when you have an eyewitness that says, look, I saw that person do that, while DNA, for example, proves that someone else was there. And the problem is that really, in truth, it's all about human beings parsing information, human beings making decisions, what exactly the information is actually pointing to. There's this really incorrect way of thinking where if I found what people call hard evidence, quote unquote, then now I know the absolute answer. But in truth, there are more gray areas than people realize. And the strive that mankind has is to try to be as accurate as possible, but with the understanding that there is the possibility that there's a mistake somewhere along the line. Because, for example, you can fake DNA these days. You can fake fingerprints. You can fake a lot of these different things. There's a way of putting on makeup that obscures the actual look of a person, and then it can be someone that resembles someone else. There are cases, for example, there was just now a case in the United States. A student was arrested because because apparently, and Apple argues it didn't do this, but he claimed that the Apple Store had a face identification software operating in a store, and he was arrested because the software thought that it was someone similar, that he was stealing from different stores, and he got arrested and publicly humiliated and so on, and he sued Apple. And he says it wasn't him. He was actually released in the end because it was proven it wasn't him. Apple denies that they use face identification software, even though the Apple phones themselves have face identification software on them. So the claim that he makes is actually very true. But the thing is, or at least based on an actual factual thing. But then we ask the question, is this same software being used inside the Apple stores to identify people who are regular clients versus people who are random versus people who are suspicious and so on? But the point is that at the end of the day, even with what we call hard evidence of forensics or technology or pictures and so on, all these things can be faked. The same way, for example, you can have a video of someone someone is recorded saying something, and then some would argue, oh, this was edited to pass on a very, very specific idea. That's not really what was being said. And this is always the issue of, does a journalist do his job properly? Is someone in the editing room trying to do something, redacting information, removing information so you don't have the entire picture and so on? At the end of the day, it's about convincing other people of what actually happened, what's the actual evidence, what's the actual truth about the occurrence that happened. But in truth, we have to understand that all forms of information can be flawed, because all forms of information are influenced by human understanding. If you give a computer, for example, all the data, for example, a human brain has to process, and let alone, for example, a jury in the United States where you have 12 different brains, 13 different brains, because you also have the judge, making decisions about what exactly the information means. At the end of the day, every legal system has to hit this brick wall of, I have to make a decision, and these are the pieces of information that I have to make this decision. It doesn't matter if it's forensic information, if it's eyewitnesses. Witnesses can be tampered with, witnesses can be intimidated, witnesses can be scared, witnesses cannot sometimes not even show up because they just passed on and they just carried on with life and they didn't want to stop talking. They want to stop and talk about what happened, and so on and so forth. At the end of the day, information is a very, very complicated set of pieces of glimpses of knowledge of what's actually going on. And at the end of the day, someone has to make a decision somewhere. This is why when you have situations which are not ideal, there's always the ongoing argument. And there's always the claims that people make. But at the end of the day, we have to understand that when you as an individual make a decision, you're making a decision based on the best knowledge that you have at that given moment. And then there are people who are experts and big experts and people who work as a committee. There's more opinions and so on. But the fact of the matter is that any decision a person makes in life requires a very, very long series of convincing information. This starts from, you want to buy a car, so you start researching the types of cars that exist, and you have to use the data of what kind of a car do you personally need. Because, for example, you go to a car lot, and you go in and you start asking about cars and everything. The first thing the person asks you is what your budget is. But that's because they're thinking about the money. Their mind is thinking in a very specific direction. But you're thinking of, no, I need to think of that direction. That's where the negotiation really begins. But the thing is that if you haven't done any research whatsoever about your car, the potential car that you want to buy, you might end up walking out. You actually need a 7-seater for all the kids that you have and everything. But if you're not thinking, you're going to walk out with a sports car that can only sit 2 people, and you have to try to find a way to put the rest of your family in that car. And that's really the concept of information. Information is based on whatever perception a person has of the data that's been presented in front of their eyes. This is why, for example, when it comes to biblical studies, which is really my field, there can be 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 or 20,000 different opinions about what a specific verse might mean, because everyone's parsing the data from a different perspective with a different set of information that relates to that specific data. So when we start talking about the concept of testimonies, because this all really does connect to one another, we start about the concept of testimonies, we have two major questions. How does a testimony actually work? And what would it mean? And the thing is that at the end of the day, and I know I'm using the term end of the day because, you can start using the term when the cows come in or whatever, you still have to make a decision. So, for example, there was an altercation, almost an altercation, a couple of weeks ago on my Facebook page where there was a question. Someone raised the question of, how do we make decisions? Now, the thing is that, for example, I tried to explain to this individual why usually the usual practice, and I use the term, the usual practice, the common practice is to use two witnesses. And this concept goes back into the Second Temple. But this is not something that was invented in the Second Temple. Two witnesses was a standard for a lot of procedures because two witnesses are much more reliable than one witness. It's much more reliable because if there's a contradiction, you can find the contradiction in the words of the witnesses and so on. But you have to understand that when you pick your witnesses, you have to know who you're picking, because if you're going to pick some random person, they're not necessarily going to remember everything that was presented before them. And therefore, usually witnesses were picked from people that you can trust. And trust is really a lot of the name of the game, because what they do, for example, in courts is they try to show that your key witness, there's something wrong with what they do. They try to defame the person. They go around, we discovered this person cheated on their taxes, or we discovered this person has been running a double life, whatever. Trying to defame, this is what lawyers do. They try to defame witnesses. They try to prove the witness is not credible because of factor X, whatever the factor X might be. And this is why when we talk about witnesses in the biblical setting, we need to first of all understand that usually when a person was a witness will be a person that's trustworthy. That's number one. But then there's the big question of, do you really need two witnesses? So you go around the Tanakh and you see a lot of cases where you hear about people using two witnesses. Our specific reading as well also talks about having two witnesses. And most of the time we find two witnesses. We hear this concept of the heavens and the earth. Technically two witnesses. We have here in Jeremiah, we have in Deuteronomy, we hear a lot about this concept of two witnesses. But we need to understand that two witnesses is when you are able to control the environment of the decision making. For example, when someone has to give a testimony about an agreement or a covenant or whatever, you actually have to be able to prove in an idyllic setting that this actually happened. So usually when you have a full control of the situation, then two witnesses is what's going to happen. However, when we go into the description of witnesses, for example, in the laws of safeguarding that we find in the book of Exodus, this is we're talking about Exodus 22. Verse basically starts at verse 9, but we need to understand it really the verse we're talking about is verse 12. So it says im tarofi taref. It's talking about if a person has is a herder and he's supervising a herd, and if a person's a herder and there's an animal attack. Now herders sometimes don't always walk together. Sometimes a person is a day laborer and he goes out, he takes care of a flock, and he's by himself. It could be a small flock of 30 animals. And I have friends who are herders, and he said, we turn about 20, 30 animals, and the right dog, you can manage such a herd. If you're dealing with a herd of hundreds of heads of sheep or goats or something, then you have to have several people watching out. Moses, for example, went out to the desert by himself. How many animals did he take care of? No one knows. But he was by himself. So think about that setting, that we actually have a description of Moshe going out to the desert, to the wilderness, and he's by himself. And that's when God reveals himself to him and says, look, I am here telling you to go redeem my people. So, what can happen is there are wild animals, and there used to be certain types of lions and bears in this area in Israel. They don't exist anymore. They were hunted into extinction. Especially by the Turks. They were hunting a lot of these animals. And what we end up with is a situation where animals can get attacked. And if you're dealing with a herd, you can lose animals and you're by yourself. and you have to stand there by yourself and say, look, the animal was attacked. So he says, Im tarofi taref yavieu ed. He says, if the animal was surely torn, he will bring an ed, not edim, he will bring an ed. This sounds more like as if there's one witness, but really the point being made here, and it says, terefa lo yeshalem, the torn animal, he won't pay. He doesn't have to pay from his own wager to cover the animal that was lost. But the interesting thing here is that this term ed can be interpreted in two different ways. It can be that, is there another witness? Because, for example, if you went out and there was another herd walking by, or you took someone with you, or someone was walking by, you can actually bring this person, this individual, because you can't testify by yourself because you're the person being charged. But if you had a witness, it uses ed, not edim. It deliberately uses the word ed, and it doesn't seem to be a collective. If you have at least one witness, you can be exempt. Now, this is in criminal law, but it says in criminal law paying a fine. And there's a difference. Then, if you go to the book of Amos, we're talking about Amos 3:12, it says, Ko amar Adonai. There's something really important about Amos, and I really, really hope one day to do a much more organized series on Amos. Amos talks a little about realistic things, and even though he's talking about one thing, you can learn other things from what he's describing. And what he's describing in this verse is actually forensic evidence of a situation. He says, Ko amar Adonai, thus says the Lord, Kasher yatzila ro'eh, as the shepherd saves from mipi ha'ari shte chaim ovedal ozen. He saves from the mouth of the lion 2 limbs, 2 legs or something, or bdal ozen, a piece of an ear even. Thus also the children of Israel will be saved who dwell in Samaria, bifat mita, at the border of a place called Mita, with Damesek Ares, and the fringes of Damascus. This is some interesting questions about the words being used here. But what he's actually describing here is also between the lines. He's describing a reality of what a farmer would do, what a shepherd would do, because he's not the owner, he's a shepherd. He needs to bring forensic evidence that the animal was torn. Look, I found a piece of the animal. Look, you can see the animal was attacked. So this is a really interesting thing. A person can prove his innocence not based necessarily on eyewitnesses, but also on forensic evidence. Now, as I said, Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson argues that only forensic evidence should be accepted, but the fact is that even if you bring this forensic evidence, you can also argue, well, he cut it off from the animal's ear, he tore it off or something. You can make any form of argument, but Amos is describing a legal reality. He's using a legal reality, an agricultural legal reality, or an agrarian legal reality, where a person would bring forensic evidence to attest that he doesn't have to pay a fine. So far we've noticed that when you're not dealing with an issue of capital punishment, and this is where the difference is going to be, when you don't deal with these types of situations, all you have to do is bring evidence of some sort. So Exodus says ed, a witness, and Amos gives us a bit more context and says a witness can also be forensic evidence. Okay, very good so far. So what's the whole deal with having to bring 2 witnesses? So when we look at this, when we look at these cases, there are 2 verses in Deuteronomy 17:6 and 19:15, and it says, "Al pi shnaim edim o shlosha edim yumat hamet." This is 17:6. In accordance to 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, the person will be put to death. Lo yumat al pi ed echad. He will not be put to death according to 1 witness. Why make the effort of making this point if it's so evident that you have to have 2 witnesses? And especially, why end the verse with saying not according to 1 witness? So that we have that verse. Then we have another verse in chapter 19. It says, Lo yakum ed echad bi'ish lechol avon ulchol chatat bechol chet asher yecheta. 1 witness will not stand against a person to any transgression or sin in any sin which he would sin. According to two witnesses or three witnesses, something will stand. Now, when you only read 19:15 by itself, you end up, because 17 is very clear, this is capital punishment. But 19, you can argue that it's actually talking about any form of any form of sin, because it says lechol avon lechol chatat, to every sin, to any sin, to any transgression. But in truth, we have to understand that you can't read verse 19 without verse 17, and you can't read verse 17 without verse 19. What we're actually talking about here is that we're dealing with situations where you actually have to physically harm someone, when you actually physically have to do a physical punishment to a person. And when we actually read the chapter that deals with this subject, you notice that a large part of the context here is murder. Chapter 19 deals with murder. The only really interesting situation is verse 14. Verse 14 creates an illusion as if 15 onwards, all the way to verse 21, is not really connected to the previous sections that we have in chapter 19. What verse 14 is really doing, first of all, you can argue verse 14 is inserted here incorrectly, but we're not going to accept that argument. But what verse 14 might actually be doing is it might give a context of the most common reason people commit murder: property violations, invasion of someone into someone else's property, or you wake up in the middle of the night and someone's moving the fence, or someone's doing something inside your own property, and you go out and you shoot them. Because this is what people sometimes show up at night to steal. And when someone trespasses on your property, you don't know if they're good or bad, and you might actually shoot them in self-defense. And there have been plenty of cases that go in that direction. So the problem we have with chapter 19 is verse 14 produces an illusion as if we've actually detached from the rest of chapter 19. But in truth, verse 14 could be a case example that indicates what is a very common situation of someone killing someone for whatever reason it might be. And then when you go into verse 15 onwards gives you a procedure that has to do with the rest of chapter 19. So because people read, and I'm not accusing, but I'm saying this is probably what's going on, because people read chapter 19, they read verse 15 detached from its actual context, they lose the fact that it's really saying something very similar, almost identical to chapter 17, verse 6, that has to do with you don't execute someone according to one witness. So this is not just regular criminal law, this is criminal law with the potential of capital punishment. And when you have to execute someone, you have to make sure 100% that this person has committed the accused crime. One witness is not enough, but only for these situations. So why do you need two witnesses, for example, in covenants? Because if you break a covenant, you can be put to death. And that's why we have this concept of two witnesses. And by the way, in a lot of ancient Near Eastern covenant documents, we actually have sometimes hundreds of witnesses because we're talking about different deities and so on. But there's a context to how witnesses actually work. So we actually do have in the Tanakh, and I'm going to pull a stunt here, we have two witnesses, because people always look for two witnesses of verses as well. We need two verses. And they say, but look, there's only one occurrence that such a concept is even brought up. Oh, that's not enough. Now, what basically happens here is that when you have control over the situation, because you're basically putting up a testimony, you're pre-planning the testimony, where witnesses show up to sign a document, to witness the signing of a document, and so on, you have control. It's a controlled environment. But when a random occurrence happens, where someone does something randomly, even if they planned it, it's random to you because you didn't know it's about to happen. And you're standing there and it happens, you have no control over the environment. And this is a division people have to produce between one situation versus the other. Two witnesses is a controlled environment, or when there's no control over the environment, one witness can be enough, as long as they can present, as long as the person is trustworthy, and if they can present some kind of evidence, then it's enough. But when we're talking about capital punishments, even if we say that the person, it's for sure this person committed the murder and the person is a trustworthy witness, we can't execute the person because of the fact that you need two witnesses and above to make sure that every piece of evidence is true, because you don't want to kill someone just because you can. And that's a real massive difference. And unfortunately, everyone who's tackled this question hasn't really drawn this line here of the differences between these pieces of information. And unfortunately, the discussion this year in regards to witnessing this and witnessing that, was there Aviv, wasn't there Aviv, did someone sight the moon, did someone not sight the moon? These are all based on a slogan, two witnesses. And has anyone actually stopped to think, is this slogan really correct? And I hope I've explained why this slogan is incorrect. So when it comes, for example, to the first month that we had this year, only one witness, and this is a trustworthy witness. This is a person who's been a friend of mine for close to 10 years. This is a true Torah observant person, a person who stretches himself to make sure he keeps Torah properly. And he calls me, he sends me a message, and he says to me, I witnessed the moon. Now, here's the thing. So we have one witness. But then we also have to remember that we have forensic evidence. And what's the forensic evidence? The fact that we have a calculation. The calculation has been in existence for thousands of years. Even before the Exodus, cultures knew that you can pre-calculate. And there's an article by, I think, Rochberg or something like that, from 2009, I think, or 2011. It's about calendars in Mesopotamia, and one of the most basic calculations, one of the most basic first things that was done by ancient cultures, and specifically the Babylonians, is they calculated the moon cycle, and they could pinpoint almost exactly when the moon should be sighted. So what we actually have here is a situation where someone sighted the moon and proved that the forensic information that we had, which, i.e., the calculation that we knew that if we had an ideal environment without clouds, it would have been seen. He was able to see the moon for a minute and a half. And this is a person I trust. This is a person I do truly trust. So when people started arguing over this information, what was actually going on is they were talking out of a very specific amount of information, and a very specific amount of information from here. And some of these people are very, very trustworthy people. I have to understand this. These are people that I would gladly sit down and have a conversation with them and gladly be their friend, because all we're trying to do is we're trying to find mutual ground so we can work together. But because there's this argument of always having to have two witnesses, and that's really what Rabbinic Judaism pushed as well, it still pushes, that you always have to have two witnesses, but there's no division here of stratas of information here of what the Torah actually says about testimonies. And I have to point out, for example, Dr. Bernard Levine has proven that Deuteronomy is very aware of Exodus. I knew this even before I read Levine's information, but he's written multiple books. There's like 3 or 4 books that I've seen by him where he demonstrates the connection. I've read articles by him. I just finished writing, by the time you hear this, it'll be at least about a month and a half, but I just finished writing a very, very long research paper where I had to use this type of information to explain the connection between Exodus and so on. And Levine puts this out, and he puts it out in several articles that he's written, and at least two two books, I think, that he's written where he shows this, he demonstrates this as factual. So when Deuteronomy talks about, when it says only according to witnesses, it's Deuteronomy is also thinking, okay, you need to think about that verse out there in Exodus 22, because that verse over there says to you, be aware of the fact that there can be only one witness to such a situation. And then what Deuteronomy is doing is also keeping in mind what happens at the end of that section in Exodus in 22-23, where he talks about, in 21, where he talks about murderers. And now it's expanding the information. Numbers expands the information. Now Deuteronomy expands the information again in chapter 19 about what do you do with murderers, what kind of murderer do you have, and so on. The information is all the information is aware of one another. And when people read one verse and then ignore another verse, when the verses have a connection between them, we end up with incorrect readings of the text. By the way, I have to point out that this is something that was taught to me by my first biblical studies professor, Dr. Cynthia Edinburgh, a prolific writer, an amazing scholar. I truly learned a lot from her. And she was the first one to really explain to me how to understand correctly legal situations in the biblical text based on how to read Deuteronomy 22 and how those verses are extremely misunderstood because there's connections between each one of the laws there. It was an eye-opening discussion years ago, several years back, and it's to this very day. I think that we need to understand how to read, and I've seen more and more scholars that actually explain these connections and explain how to understand all this information. And the same thing goes, for example, by the way, just regarding the calendar, people say, oh, the Jewish calendar is from Babylon. There's a lot of this type of stuff. They have these fragments of information, and I highly and strongly recommend to anyone who really wants to understand things, take your time to read the sources and understand what these sources are actually saying. By the way, regarding the calendar from Babylon, it's very important to point out, all it says in the Talmud is that the names of the months came in from Babylon because it was an administrative issue. When they came from Babylon, there was no king, there was no sovereignty, and what happened was that they had to maintain a calendar that's linked to the names used in Babylon. So when they communicate with the government, they can use the same names. Because if we say, "Oh, the first month," an official will look at you like, what? What are you talking about? This actually has a name. This is called Nisanu. 7th month, Tashritu. That was really what's going on. It had absolutely nothing to do with the question of did the Babylonian calendar influence the way they were keeping Torah in the land of Israel? Of course not. The mandate given to Ezra was that he had full authority on the religious sense. You have to understand what the Aramaic is actually saying there. He was given full-blown authority onto making legal decisions based on Torah because he was a Kohen. And that was his authority. So now, after I've explained this concept of witnesses, and even though there's still a lot that can be said, we're trying to at least produce a better understanding of how testimony works. We can actually go into this section because it talks about God using Jeremiah as a symbolic, Yirmiyahu as a symbolic concept of the return of Israel to its land. Because everyone, when you read Jeremiah, when you read Yirmiyahu, you always think Yirmiyahu is all about destruction and everything, but there are glimpses of light every once in a while inside his prophecies, because he's saying, look, the purpose is not to hurt and punish, but God has a covenant, and the covenant requires him to punish when people break his law. But this is because the law requires this, because the structure requires this, because if you're going to allow a person to do whatever they want, even though they signed a contract, they're just going to keep on corrupting until one day everything is going to be destroyed. So there's sometimes a need to put a destruction or to put a threat to make sure that the person who signed the contract is going to keep the promises. So we have here a concept here of covenantal language, of covenantal structure, where two witnesses show up and they sign a testimony, by the way, a double testimony. There's one that was an open document and one that was sealed and kept somewhere, and we might one day discover a jar somewhere that contains these signatures. You never know. But the main point here is that this is about the land, this is about the promise of the land, this is all covenant. And Jeremiah actually has connections to Deuteronomy. So there's Friedman wrote a book called Who Wrote the Bible, and he makes an assumption there which I think is completely wrong. But he says, look, there's very clear connections between Jeremiah and Deuteronomy, so he wants to conclude Deuteronomy was written by Jeremiah. It's a novelty idea, and I have a lot of respect to Dr. Friedman, but I don't think he's right about that one. But in any case, there's a very clear connection here, because Jeremiah is really the prophet of covenant, while Ezekiel is the prophet of holiness, and Amos is the prophet of morality, and Hosea is the prophet of marriage. They have themes inside their books. So it starts off here with a very simple transaction, but the transaction is here, it's here to make a point about the concept of the covenant. So it says, Vayomer Yirmiyahu, Hayad devar Adonai elai le'emor. So this is in chapter 32, starting from verse 6. Our reading goes from verse 6 all the way to verse 27, so about 22 verses. It says, and Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu said, the word of the Lord was to me, saying, Hine Hanamel ben Shalom dodecha. So a man called Hanamel, son of Shalom, dodcha. Dodcha is a term which usually translates as uncle, but this can also mean his cousin or someone who is related to him, blood related, but is not his father, mother, brother, or sister. So it says, Hine Hanamel ben Shalom ben dodcha ba elecha le'emor. So he says, behold, expect this about to happen. Your relative Hanamel is going to come to you saying, buy for yourself my field which is in Anatot. Anatot was apparently a priestly city. They had property there, and he told, buy my property. Why do you have to buy my property? We don't really know. But he says, for you is the law of redemption to buy. Hanamel probably had to take a loan, or he said, look, I need to pass on this property to a relative for some reason, so you buy this from me. And the term goel here really means a relative who can redeem, a relative that can protect and save. So you go back to the laws which appear in Numbers. We talk about families and property and so on. So it says, so he says fulfillment, immediately fulfillment. Hanamel, my relative, came as the word of the Lord to the Chatzar HaMatara, to this imprisonment courtyard that he called the Chatzar HaMatara. And he's basically been imprisoned there for a while. So his cousin has to come over. It seems to be his cousin. Vayomer elai, kne et tzadi asher ba'anatot asher be'eretz Binyamin. And he said to me, this is full fulfillment, buy from me, please buy the field, my field which is in Anatot, which is in the land of Binyamin. He's becoming very specific, because there could be another Anatot. Remember, this is a transaction. So usually when you sell property, you usually have a section that explains, or maps attached to explain exactly where the property is. So this is why he's expanding this. And he says to me, I want you to buy the field of my field in Anatot, and they probably get from this tree to that tree, from this rock to that rock, and whatever. But it's in the land of Binyamin, to make sure it's clear which Anatot we're talking about. It says, Ki lecha mishpata Yerusha, ulecha geula kenelach. It says, to you, the law of inheritance, you're my relative, you're the one who's allowed to take over my property. To you is the judgment of redemption. Ve'eda ki dvar Adonaihu. And then I knew that this is the word of the Lord. Interesting. It's an interesting statement, but he's saying, look, it's very clear that God sent this. And it might be that Jeremiah sometimes had dreams that he wasn't too sure if this was it. There's an interesting question here about prophecy, where he says, look, I'm not sure if this is sometimes always 100% real. It's interesting that he's self-critical about his prophecies. It says, so I bought so he's talking in the first person, so I bought the field from Hanamel, my cousin, who's from Anatot. And I weighed the money. He's going through the entire process of the contract. First of all, you weigh the money. Avraham does a very similar thing as well. 7 shekels means 7 full weights of shekels, and 10 silver. 10 silver is not very clear what this exactly means, but some people say maybe 7 shekels and 10 silver really means 17 shekels of silver. That's more than, at least in some points in the Bronze and early Iron Age, this was more than a yearly wager. So he's basically paid something like approximately a year and a half wager, something like that. And each one of these shekels is about 11 grams, more or less. There's some debate over that. And he weighs the money. But then, it's interesting, he's describing to us the entire process of what had to be done here. Because when we read in Deuteronomy, when we read in Exodus, when the covenant is struck, we read in the entire process, so he's doing something very similar to that. So it says, and I wrote in a book, and I sealed it. So sefer here can mean a scroll or a clay tablet. Sefer is really a word that's used to indicate anything you write on. And I signed Va'ed Aidim, and I made sure there were witnesses. Va'eshkol hakesef b'maznayim, and I weighed the money on the scales. It says, Va'ikach et sefer hamiknah, et hachatum hamitzvah v'achukim v'et hagalui. So it describes some interesting details here. So I took the book of buying, meaning the contract itself, et hachatum, that which is signed, hamitzvah v'achukim, the laws and the commandments. He's really also partially alluding here to the Torah itself, because this is really the purpose. But it seems to be also that the contract contained details of what's allowed and forbidden in regards to the field. V'et galui, and that which is revealed. So it looks as if there were 2 copies. One was a copy that was sealed and put in an archive, and then a copy that's kept by the buyer and the seller, maybe. So the buyer keeps the copy because he needs to prove that he bought the property. And if there's ever a dispute, you go to the archive and you compare them, and they say, look, if this is real or not. By the way, to this very day, in Rabbinic Judaism, when, for example, certain things like, for example, a wedding contract is signed, called a ketubah, there's always 2 copies. A copy is kept by the wife, because this is her legal document, and a copy kept in the rabbinate. If there's ever an argument, or if there's ever an issue, there's another copy. It says, Vayten et sefer hamiknah leBaruch ben Neriah ben Mechsaya le'einei Hanamel Dodi. I gave the book of buying to Baruch, son of Neriah, son of Mechsaya, before the eyes of Hanamel, my cousin, because he wants to show, look, we wrote this is a real scribe, he's in charge, gave it to him, he's going to safeguard this. ולעיני העדים הכותבים בספר המקנא, and before the eyes of the witnesses who wrote in the book of buying, לעיני כל היהודים. So it's interesting. You have the 2 witnesses who are assigned, but there's other people can witness as well. It's almost like a wedding in Judaism. That usually there's the 2 witnesses, and that's it. Everyone else is not a witness, but it's done before their eyes as well. So it's an interesting situation. But he says, look, this was done publicly. So no one can argue that this is fake. And why is this being pointed? Heavens and the earth are the witnesses of the covenant between the God of Israel and Israel. 2 tablets are witnesses as well. The argument is, there's an article written years ago, that the 2 tablets are really 2 copies of the same text. The one tablet had 10 commandments, the other tablet had 10 commandments as well, written from both sides because you had to put all the information into it. And this was done with 2 witnesses, the heavens and the earth, with Israel, between Israel and God. But the whole world presumably knew about this. And Jeremiah actually says the whole world knew about your power when you brought Israel out. So there's a bit of a reenactment here of Mount Sinai. And he says, "Vatzavet Baruch le'einehem lemon." I commanded Baruch before their eyes, saying, "Ko amar Adonai Tzevaot Elohei Yisrael." This is the Lord God, the Lord of hosts, God of Israel. Lakoach et sefarim ha'ele. Take these books, et sefer hamiknah hazeh, v'et hachatum v'et sefer hagalui hazeh. This book of buying, the sealed and the revealed. Untatam b'chli chares, and you place them in a clay jar, and that's why I said earlier we might find one day a clay jar that contains these documents. Leman ya'amdu yamim rabim, for in order that they stand for many days. Yamim rabim can be to the end of the exile. Ki cho amar Adonai Tzevaot Elohei Yisrael, and thus is the Lord God of Israel, the Lord of hosts, God of Israel. Od yiknu vatim v'sadot uchramim ba'aretz hazot. It will also certainly be that people will buy again houses and fields and vineyards in this land. Because the prophet is making really a point here that even though the prophecy is about destruction, there's going to be redemption. But then Jeremiah has a conflict. He has a massive question here about faith, and he prays. Reminds you a little bit about Habakkuk. Habakkuk has theological question. He says, "Vaytpa'el Adonai acharei titi et sefer hamikna." This is verse 16. And I prayed to the Lord after I gave the book of the buying, and Baruch ben Neriah lemor, to Baruch son Neriah, he gave the books to, saying, he laments, "Aha, Adonai Elohim, alas, Lord God, hine ata asita et hashamayim ve'et haaretz, behold, you made the heavens and the earth." Hint, hint. "Bechochacha gadol v'zroacha netuya," with your great strength and your outstretched arm. Exodus, think about Exodus here. "V'lo yipalel mimecha kol davar," nothing is beyond you. "Oseh chesed la'alafim," think about the 13 attributes mentioned in the book of Exodus. "Oseh chesed la'alafim u'shalem avon avot el chek benehem acharehem." So he's talking about here the question of generational retribution, who does mercy to the thousands and pays back to the iniquities of fathers to the bosom of their sons after them. Ha'el gadol gibor Adonai tzevaot shemo, the great and mighty Lord of hosts, his name. He's hinting here to elements where we see in Exodus. Gadol ha'etzah v'rav ha'aliliyah, great of decision making. Etzah is really here advice, but really has to do with decision making. V'rav ha'aliliyah, of great deeds. Asher einecha fekuchot al kol darchei bnei adam, which your eyes are open on all the ways of mankind. Latet leish kedrachav u'chifrim alalav, to give to each person according to his ways and according to the fruit of his deeds. Hallelujah, ma'alalav. There's a little game here with some of the words. But what he's presenting here is an all-knowing, all-powerful God who does judgment when necessary and pays people for their deeds. Now we have Egypt explicitly described. If you've placed signs and miracles or great deeds in the land of Egypt to this very day, 960 years later, these people still remember what exactly happened. This is why I said, think about Egypt and all of this, in the Exodus. And Israel and man. Israel remembers, people remember what happened. And you made for yourself a name like this very day. To this very day, people remember what you did. There's a very, very long exposition here saying, look, God, you are a God of judgment as well, but you're also God of mercy, and there's some imbalance here. And he says, "V'totzeh et amechai et Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim." You brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt. Be'otot u'v'moftim v'yad chazaka u've'ezroa netuya u've'mora gadol. So you brought your people of Israel out of the land of Egypt with signs and miracles, with a strong hand, a stretched arm. Ezroa, by the way, it's with an extra aleph here. It's a bit of an unusual spelling. It's called a prostatic aleph. Happens every once in a while. Happens also in Job 31:22. And with great fear, "Vatiten lahem et haaretz hazon," he gave to them this land, "asher nishbata la'avotam latet lahem," which you vowed to their fathers to give to them, "eretz zavat halav udvash," a land flowing with milk and honey. So he's giving the history here. "Vayavo vayirshu ota," and they came and they inherited it. "Velo sham'u bekolecha," and they did not heed to your voice. "Lo alchu et kol asher tzivite lahem la'asot lo asu," they did not go. Or actually, you should read, "Velo sham'u bekolecha u'v'toratcha lo halachu," they didn't heed to your voice, and by your laws, your Torah, they didn't go. "Et kol asher tzivite lahem la'asot lo asu," all that you commanded them to do, they didn't do. "V'tikareh otam et kol hara hazot," and all this evil, all this wickedness had happened to them. He's still talking about the destruction, the threat of the Babylonians. He says, "Hinei hasolelot ba'u ha'ir l'chadah." The solelot, these are either the ramps, the siege ramps, or the siege machines, came to the city to capture it. Va'ir nitna be'ad ha'kasdim ha'nilchamim aleh, and the city has been given to the hands of the Chaldeans who are fighting against it. Mipnei ha'cherev va'ra'av v'hadaver, because of the sword and the famine and the plague. As you spoke, you threatened, and it's happening. You're seeing this presumably with your own eyes. God, look, you're doing this by yourself. And then he asked the question. So we have this very, very long exposition. And then he asked the final question. And you said to me, Adonai Elohim, you said to me, Lord God, buy to yourself this field with silver, with money, and bring witnesses. And the city's being given to the hands of the Chaldeans. He's standing there and he's going like, I don't understand. So God responds, he says, the word of the Lord was to Jeremiah saying, says, behold, I am the Lord, the God of all flesh. Would anything be beyond me? So it's kind of interesting. This is actually where the reading ends, because we already know the answer. And the answer is there's always hope. The discussion here has already been answered in the previous section. This is why in the last verse of the previous section, people will return here. But Jeremiah is asking a question here, and he says, why even do this? And God says, because nothing is beyond me. But what is this answer? Is anything beyond? It looks like as if Jeremiah's question is, this is an improbability. This is impossible. You're telling me to buy a field. You're telling me to do all these things. But this is impossible. Look, the city is about to be destroyed. And God's response is, nothing is impossible. Nothing is beyond my ability. You cannot stop me even if you try. And that's why it ends with this. This is why we stop here in the middle of a section. Actually, in the beginning of the section, we stop there because that's the point being made. There's always hope, and God always has a plan, and it's always going somewhere. And you can argue maybe that this section should be before the first section, but the editing could be I'm completely wrong about this. But the point is that God says, look, I have to bring the judgment upon them. Because we have to remember that the one of the main messages of Jeremiah is the fact that they have to be punished. But another very important side here, which is always a subtext that exists in Yirmiyahu, is that there's always hope. There's always a chance of redemption. But Yirmiyahu's structure always has destruction, some hope, carry on with destruction. And this is why this chapter is structured this way, because it follows the pattern of how Yirmiyahu is built. At least that's the way I understand it. But there's always this glimmer of hope. Even in the time of destruction, there's always this glimmer of hope somewhere. And this is why we end the reading with, nothing is beyond me. Yes, they're out there. They're sieging on the city. It's about it's all about the city's about to be breached, and everything is going to go really, really sideways here, and everything is going to be destroyed. But there's always hope. There's always hope, even in the most dire situations. There's always a glimmer of hope, and that's the message here. I hope you enjoyed this recording. Please consider helping Hebrew in Israel with research material by donating at HebrewInIsrael.net. But the most important side of all of this is to make sure that we share this information, that we have a real discussion, and not fall into dogmas and not fall into the mistake Jeremiah makes. He says, this is impossible, and God says, nothing is impossible. To allow ourselves to have a discussion to enable us to understand better what's actually being said. To make sure that we know where we're going to with this information, instead of saying impossible, 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 and rooting ourselves into the ground and ignoring the possibility that there's maybe something else out there that we need to look at. Thank you. Kol Tuv.